The charge against Dale Corrin read like a death sentence dressed in legalese. 3 violations of galactic heritage, Statute 114, unlawful entry into a Class 7 sealed heritage zone, theft of catalogued antiquities across 2 sovereign jurisdictions, reckless endangerment of a protected archaeological site, and one final count that the prosecuting arbiter had added just that morning, almost as an afterthought: desecration of a pre-stellar sacred monument. Dale stood in the holding alcove behind the tribunal chamber's main arch, wrists bound in soft-lock restraints that hummed against his pulse, and listened to the bailiff read the additions through the wall. He didn't flinch. He'd been expecting worse. The tribunal was convened on Verath Null, a decommissioned relay station the Concord of Free Peoples had converted into a neutral court decades ago. Its main chamber was an ugly thing, high-vaulted but sterile, the walls paneled in matte composite that lined freight corridors. No ornamentation, no history. The Concord liked it that way. Heritage disputes were supposed to be adjudicated in spaces that carried no heritage of their own. But Dale knew what sat at the center of that chamber, because he'd caught a glimpse on the security feed when they'd brought him in. The Valith throne. They'd hauled it from Keth Saranu, from the sealed palace antechamber, where it had stood untouched for 11,000 years, and placed it on a reinforced platform in the middle of the tribunal floor. Exhibit 1. The object of his obsession, the thing he'd ruined his life chasing, sitting under fluorescent judicial lighting like impounded cargo. The throne was carved from a single block of tesserated basalt, a stone so dense and so precisely crystallized that modern fabrication couldn't replicate it. Its surface was covered in script not engraved but grown, the characters threaded through the mineral structure itself as though the stone had formed around the language. 11,000 years of stillness, and the script had never weathered, never chipped. The seat was broad and low, built for a body shape that matched no known species in the Concord's records. Its armrests ended in carved hands open, palms up, fingers slightly curled, as though waiting to receive something. No one had ever sat in it, not in any recorded era. Dale Corrin, the bailiff said, opening the alcove's privacy screen. The tribunal is ready. He stepped through. The chamber held perhaps 60 observers, Concord officials in their blue-gray service, where Keith Ronnie heritage delegates in wrapped white vestments, a handful of academic consultants flown in to authenticate his alleged crimes, and 3 arbiters on a raised dais at the far end. The lead arbiter was a Tessarine named Adha Ven, thin-faced and meticulous, known across the sector for a conviction rate that made defense advocates go pale. The 2 flanking arbiters were human, a concession to Dale's species, though neither looked sympathetic. Between the dais and the holding alcove, the Valith throne sat on its platform, dark and still. Dale looked at it. Even across 10 meters of sterile tribunal floor, even under flat judicial lighting that was designed to drain every object in the room of mystery and grandeur, the throne refused to be ordinary. The script on its surface caught the light in ways the composite panels did not, a faint luminescence that shifted when he moved, as though the characters were tracking him. Not glowing, not pulsing, just aware. The way a mirror is aware of whoever stands before it. He'd noticed that behavior on Keth Saranu. First at 60 meters, where it had been barely perceptible, a trick of light, he'd told himself. Then at 40, where the effect was unmistakable. At 20, the characters had seemed to lean toward him, the luminescence brightening fractionally with each step. At 5 meters, where the wardens had found him and the enforcement cordon had closed, the script had been so bright that he could read individual characters without a lamp. He had never touched it. He had never tried to sit in it. He had never reached for the open stone hands at the ends of its armrests. That fact, the fact that he'd stopped voluntarily, 5 meters away, and simply stood, was the only thing standing between him and a full desecration conviction. The prosecution had wanted to charge him with attempted physical interference, but the evidence didn't support it. Dale hadn't stopped because the wardens had arrived. He'd stopped because arriving had been enough. He'd heard what he'd come to hear. The hum, the call, the confirmation that what he'd felt from halfway across the spiral arm was real and present and directed at him. "The defendant will identify himself for the record," Oudhavin said. Dale Corin, maintenance technician, 3rd class, licensed to Deepwell Station, Carthen Sector. He kept his voice flat. The title sounded absurd here, a man who fixed atmospheric recyclers standing trial for crimes against an 11,000-year-old alien monument. But it was what he was. What he had been before the obsession ate his career, his savings, his marriage, and his reputation, one quiet meal at a time. "The prosecution may proceed." Savuteln rose slowly from the prosecution's table. She was Keithrani, tall, deliberate, her wrapped vestments enforcing a posture of constant dignity. She addressed the tribunal with the careful cadence of someone who had rehearsed every sentence until it functioned like a blade. "The Valeth throne has been sealed within the palace of Keth Saranu for 11,241 standard years. In that time, no individual Keithrani or otherwise has been permitted physical proximity. The seal barriers were not decorative. They were a sacred trust. The defendant bypassed 4 of them using modified excavation equipment, entered the antechamber in violation of every covenant protecting the site, and was apprehended 5 meters from the throne. He carried no authorization, no academic credential, no diplomatic clearance." She paused to let the words settle into the record. "He is a maintenance worker from an industrial station who decided, by his own admission, that an 11,000-year prohibition did not apply to him." She turned to address the gallery directly. "The custodial body of Keth Saranu has preserved this monument through 2 civil upheavals, 1 interstellar war, and the collapse and reconstitution of the Concord itself. 73 generations of custodians have lived inside the palace complex without ever entering the antechamber. They monitored the seal barriers. They studied the partial transcriptions their ancestors had made before the final sealing. They trained their children and their children's children to maintain a vigil that has lasted longer than most civilizations survive. And the defendant bypassed their work in 3 hours with a bag of modified maintenance tools." Dale felt the gallery watching him, 60 pairs of eyes measuring the distance between what he looked like a tired man in detention coveralls, wrists bound, face weathered by years of maintenance work in recycled station air, and what he was accused of. He could see the calculation in their faces. How could this person, this nobody from a station that processed industrial waste, be worth the attention of a tribunal this size? "We do not allege that he touched the throne. We allege that his presence within the antechamber caused measurable disruption to the site's resonance field, a disruption that the monitoring stations recorded for the first time in their operational history. Something in the throne responded to his intrusion. That response, whatever its nature, constitutes damage to an irreplaceable cultural monument." Measurable disruption. Something responded. They were describing what he'd felt, the hum changing, sharpening, when he'd entered the antechamber. They were framing it as damage. He wanted to tell them it was the opposite, that the throne had been waiting, and what they'd measured was its original function awakening after 11 millennia of silence. But he'd learned, in 4 months of detention, that telling people what the throne wanted was not a strategy that inspired confidence. "What does the defendant wish to enter?" Oudhavin asked. "Not guilty on all counts." A murmur moved through the observers. One of the Keithrani delegates in the gallery leaned forward, white vestments rustling against the seat. "The tribunal notes the plea. We will hear testimony." They started with the technical witnesses. A resonance engineer named Ilatoric Human, Concord contracted, hair pulled back in a tight professional knot, presented the monitoring data from Keth Saranu. Charts filled the projection screen above the dais. Waveform captures, spectral analyses, 3 centuries of baseline data compressed into smooth trend lines. The throne's ambient resonance has been stable within a 2% variance band for as long as the monitoring equipment has been installed, Ilatorek said, tracing the flatline portion of the chart with a stylus. 312 years. Temperature shifts, seismic events, even the controlled maintenance entries by Keith Ronnie custodians, none of them produced significant deviation. She tapped the stylus, the chart jumped. On the day the defendant entered the antechamber, the variance spiked to 19% within the first 4 seconds of his presence. In the 11 seconds before the wardens reached him, it continued climbing. What was the peak reading? Adhavin asked. 31%, above baseline, at the moment of apprehension. In the 7 minutes after his removal from the chamber, it declined to 14%. Full return to normal parameters took 48 hours. One of the human arbiters, a heavy-set man with a legal scholar's squint, leaned into his microphone. You said the wardens who entered the same space at the same time caused no measurable deviation. Correct. The resonance responded to the defendant specifically. 4 wardens, 1 enforcement officer, 2 forensic technicians all present in the same chamber during or immediately after the arrest. No deviation from any of them. Whatever the throne's resonance field is calibrated to detect, the defendant registered as a significant input. The rest of us registered as furniture. Dale watched the arbiter process that. A significant input, not a trespasser, not a vandal. The throne's own systems had singled him out, and the prosecution was using that distinction as proof of harm. Was the resonance field damaged? Saren Mack asked from the defense table. Dale's assigned defense advocate was a tired-looking human woman who'd drawn the case from the public pool and clearly wished she hadn't. But she asked the right questions. Ilatorek hesitated. The field returned to baseline. There's no evidence of permanent alteration. So the disruption was temporary and self-correcting. Yes. And the throne's monitoring systems show no degradation of function. The monitoring systems aren't designed to measure function. They measure output. The output returned to normal. Whether the throne's internal function was affected is beyond our ability to assess. Saren Mack nodded, and Dale saw the small satisfaction in her posture. First crack. The prosecution couldn't prove permanent damage because the throne itself had healed, if healing was even the right word for a mechanism returning to its original state after doing exactly what it was built to do. The next witness was Keith Ronnie. Dalu Orsh, heritage scholar, elderly and precise, her vestments of an older cut that marked her rank within the custodial hierarchy. She described the theological significance of the Valith throne in terms that Dale had spent 14 months piecing together from fragmentary records and black market data cores. The Valith throne is the seat of judgment, Dalu Orsh said. In our oldest texts, those that predate the Keith Ronnie civilization itself, inherited from a predecessor culture, we know only as the architects it is described as a mechanism of truth. A device that recognizes not power, not rank, not lineage, but honesty. She straightened and the gallery went quiet. The texts state that the throne was sealed because no one who approached it was found worthy. It refused every claimant for 3,000 years before the first Keith Ronnie generation elected to seal it permanently and build the palace around it as a monument to what it had rejected. Refused them how? Adhavin asked. Silence. The throne is described as having a voice, a capacity to speak, to render judgment. In its active era, claimants would approach, and the throne would either speak or remain silent. Silence was rejection. Dalu Orsh's voice carried the weight of someone reciting scripture she had spent her life studying. In 3,000 years of recorded attempts, it never spoke, not once. She turned to the gallery, and her voice took on the cadence of deep history. We have records of 2,417 individual claimants across the active era, priest-kings who had unified continents, warrior sages who had ended wars with a single word, philosophers who had written moral codes that governed billions, children selected for their innocence, elders chosen for their wisdom, monks who had renounced every possession and ambition, criminals who had been rehabilitated through decades of service. The architects were methodical. They did not simply present their best. They presented their range, every permutation of character they could conceive of, hoping that somewhere in the diversity of their species, the quality the throne sought would appear. She paused. All of them received silence. Every last one. The texts describe the final claimant, a woman named Varasethi, a teacher from a small coastal settlement who had no particular distinction. She was the last person the architects sent before the sealing. The throne gave her the same silence it had given every king and conqueror before her. After that, the decision was made. They concluded that what the throne sought did not yet exist among them. Perhaps did not yet exist at all. So they sealed it, not in anger, in faith, in the belief that the universe was still making the thing the throne was listening for, and that one day, across whatever distance and whatever span of time was necessary, it would arrive. The chamber absorbed that. 3,000 years of silence. 2,417 rejected claimants, then 11,000 more years behind the seals. Dale felt something shift in his chest, not the hum, which had been a constant low presence since they'd brought the throne into the chamber, but something more personal. Grief, perhaps, for Varasethi, for all of them. For 2,417 people who had stood before the throne and been told, through silence, that they were not what it was looking for. Not because they were flawed, because they were performing, even the best of them, even the most sincere. And the defendant's intrusion, Otthaven pressed, does it threaten this mechanism? Any unauthorized interaction threatens it. We have preserved the throne's integrity for millennia precisely by preventing contact. The resonance spike suggests that the defendant's presence activated dormant systems. Activation without understanding, without preparation, without consent of the custodial body, that is desecration, regardless of intent. Saren Mack rose for cross-examination. She moved to the center of the floor, positioning herself between the prosecution table and the throne. From that angle, Dale noticed, the script on the throne's surface seemed to glow fractionally brighter. Scholar Orsh, you described the throne as a mechanism of truth that recognizes honesty. If it responded to my client's presence, and the resonance data says it did, doesn't that response carry meaning under your own theological framework? Dalu Orsh went very still. The question hung in the air for 3 full seconds before she answered. The response carries meaning only if one accepts that the defendant is what the throne's original function was designed to identify. Our position is that the response was an anomaly caused by intrusion, not a legitimate activation. But you don't know that. We know that no one has been worthy in 14,000 years. The probability that a maintenance technician from an industrial station. I'm not asking about probability. I'm asking whether your own sacred texts provide a framework in which the throne's response to my client would be considered a legitimate recognition event. Silence. The younger Keithrani delegate in the gallery gripped the arm of her seat. 2 of the conquered officials exchanged a glance. Yes, Dalu Orsh said, they do. A ripple of tension moved through the delegates. Savuteln's face tightened. This was the crack, the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the prosecution's case. They couldn't claim the throne was a sacred mechanism of judgment, and simultaneously deny that its judgment meant anything when it judged in a way they didn't expect. Otthaven called a recess. The observers filed out in low clusters of conversation. Dale was returned to his alcove. Through the privacy screen, he heard the Keithrani delegates arguing in urgent whispers. He pressed his forehead against the cool wall and closed his eyes. The hum was there, fainter, filtered through walls and distance, but unmistakable. The throne was still aware of him. He thought about how it had started. 14 months ago on Deepwell Station, elbow-deep in a corroded fluid coupling that served the waste processing system. A routine job. The kind of work he'd done for 9 years, competent, quiet, invisible. Nobody noticed maintenance technicians unless something broke. That was the deal. You kept the systems running, the station kept paying you, and the years stacked up like identical bricks in a wall that led nowhere. The data core had been in a junk lot on the station's commercial level. He'd bought it for 12 credits because the vendor said it contained old survey data from the Keth Saranu region, and Dale had always collected old things. Not valuable things. Old ones. Maps. Records. Languages nobody spoke anymore. He'd taught himself to read architect script from a linguistic database he'd found in a decommissioned library terminal, years before any of this. Curiosity. A maintenance technician with too many quiet evenings and a hunger to understand things that had been abandoned. The data core had contained a partial translation of an architect text that referenced the Valith throne's original function in terms he'd never encountered in any published scholarship. Not a seat of judgment in the courtroom sense. A seat of resonance. A mechanism tuned to detect a specific quality in the beings who approached it, not power, not bloodline, not knowledge, but something the text called the unworn voice. The voice that had not been shaped by ambition or performance or fear. The voice that simply said what was true. He'd read that phrase, the unworn voice, and something had shifted in his chest. Not excitement, recognition. Quiet, bone-deep certainty that this was what he'd been looking for without knowing he'd been looking at all. That certainty had consumed everything. He'd quit Deepwell within a week of reading the phrase. His supervisor, a decent woman named Torin who'd valued his reliability, had looked at him across the maintenance bay with an expression that was equal parts confusion and concern. "You've been here 9 years, Corin. You've never missed a shift. You've never asked for a transfer, and now you're resigning, effective immediately, to go look for a chair." "A throne," he'd said, "and it's not that I want to go. It's that I can't not go." Torin had filed the paperwork without another word. She'd known him long enough to recognize when Dale said something he meant all the way through. He'd spent his savings on transit and equipment, tracked down 3 more fragmentary techs across 2 systems, buying access with labor when he ran out of credits. In the basement of a Keith Ronnie archive on Veth Station, he'd rewired a failing ventilation system, 12 hours of crawling through ducts meant for smaller bodies, in exchange for supervised access to a damaged scroll that contained 47 lines of architect script referencing the throne's calibration parameters. On a salvage barge in the Carthan shipping lanes, he'd repaired 17 docking clamps for a data broker named Hall who had a partial architect lexicon in his personal collection. Hall had watched him work and asked what a maintenance tech wanted with dead languages. "They're not dead," Dale had said. "They're waiting." Hall had given him the lexicon for free. Something in Dale's voice, apparently, had convinced him that arguing would be a waste of both their time. Then Esra. The hardest part. His wife of 7 years, patient and practical, who had understood Dale's collection of old things and old languages as an endearing eccentricity. The mechanic who read ancient scripts the way other men watched sports feeds. She had not understood the obsession. The word obsession itself had been hers, lobbed across their small apartment on Deepwell, during the conversation that ended their marriage. "You're obsessed, Dale. You know that, right? You're giving up everything for a thing you've never seen, on a planet you've never visited, based on a text you bought from a junk vendor for 12 credits. I know what it sounds like. It sounds like madness. It's not madness. It's the first thing that's ever made complete sense to me." She'd left, not in anger, in grief. The grief of a woman who loved a good man and understood with terrible clarity that the good man had been claimed by something older and larger than their life together. The last thing she'd said to him was, "I hope it's worth it, Dale. I really do." He hadn't answered, not because he didn't know what to say, but because the honest answer it already is would have been too cruel to speak aloud. He'd learned enough about Keith Ronnie seal barrier engineering to understand what he'd need to bypass them, and then acquired the tools from a decommissioned heritage site maintenance depot. Standard equipment. The kind of thing any maintenance technician would recognize. The modifications he'd made were practical, not clever, the work of a man who understood how systems fit together and could see the gaps in any lock that ran on electricity and logic. He'd known it was illegal. He'd known the consequences. He'd done it anyway, because the hum had been calling him from halfway across the spiral arm, and he could no more ignore it than he could stop his own heartbeat. That was the part he couldn't explain to the tribunal. The obsession wasn't madness. It was the most rational thing he'd ever experienced, the understanding that he had been recognized by something before he'd ever been in its presence, and that the recognition was mutual. The throne had been calling. He had answered. Everything between those two facts was just logistics. The recess ended. Dale was brought back to the chamber. The afternoon session opened with enforcement testimony. The lead warden, a Keith Ronnie officer named Reth Davari, broad-shouldered for his species and visibly angry about the entire proceeding, described the breach in clinical detail. 4 seal barriers, bypassed in sequence over approximately 3 hours. Each bypass was surgical. The barrier's locking mechanisms had been electronically spoofed, not physically broken. Everyone had been restored to full function within hours of the arrest. The defendant's route through the palace was direct, Reth Davari said. He did not explore. He did not deviate. He went straight to the antechamber. Through 2 sealed corridors, 1 collapsed section that required him to cut through a secondary wall, and 2 final barriers at the antechamber doors themselves. Total distance from his entry point, approximately 90 meters. He covered it in 3 hours and 4 minutes, including the time spent on bypasses. Did he attempt to conceal his presence? Savuteln asked. No, he left clear evidence at every barrier. His equipment was standard maintenance grade modified, but not military or intelligence grade. The modifications were competent but not sophisticated. He was not trying to avoid detection. He was trying to get to the throne before detection stopped him. Saren Mack's cross-examination established the facts Dale needed on the record. No physical damage to any barrier. No structural harm to the palace. No artifacts removed. The only thing Dale had taken from Keth Serrano was the experience of standing in the antechamber for 11 seconds and feeling the hum sharpen to a frequency that made his teeth ache. When you apprehended the defendant, Saren Mack asked, what was he doing? Reth Davari paused. The pause lasted long enough for the gallery to notice. Standing. Just standing. He was standing approximately 5 meters from the throne, facing it. His hands were at his sides. He was not moving. He was not attempting to approach further. He was not attempting to flee. What was his demeanor? Another pause, longer. Calm he appeared. Calm. When we ordered him to the ground, he complied immediately. He said one thing. What did he say? He said, I heard it. That's enough. The words settled over the chamber. Dale remembered saying them. He remembered the wardens' faces, the confusion that had cut through their professional anger, the unsettled uncertainty of armed officers confronting a man who had committed serious crimes and then stopped, voluntarily, 5 meters from his objective. A thief who didn't steal. A trespasser who didn't touch. A man who'd ruined his life to get into a room and had then simply stood there, listening, until they came for him. He also remembered what Reth Davari wasn't saying. The thing that happened as they'd marched him out of the antechamber. The hum, the throne's resonance had followed him. Not physically, not like a sound tracking a moving source. But the intensity of it had shifted, orienting toward the corridor he was being led down, as though the mechanism inside the stone was reaching after him. One of the wardens, a young officer whose name Dale never learned, had stumbled at the threshold and looked back at the throne with an expression of naked fear. The warden had felt it too. Something in the chamber was paying attention to their prisoner, and it didn't want him to leave. Reth Davari hadn't mentioned that. Professional discretion, perhaps, or professional denial. The prosecution called 2 more witnesses. A forensic specialist named Kelly's Varn cataloged Dale's equipment in painstaking detail. A handheld resonance scanner, maintenance grade, modified for higher sensitivity. A set of electronic bypass probes, standard issue for sealed system maintenance, recalibrated for heritage-class locking mechanisms. A portable cutting tool, the kind used for removing corroded wall panels on station maintenance runs. Nutrient packs for 36 hours, a water supply, and a journal. The journal drew the gallery's attention. Kelly's Varn read several entries into the record, not because they were incriminating in the criminal sense, but because they painted a picture of a man whose obsession had organized his entire existence. Entry dated 14 months before the breach, Kelly's Varn read. The second fragment confirms the first. The throne was not made to judge. It was made to find. The architects were looking for something they couldn't produce themselves, a quality, a resonance, an honesty so fundamental that it couldn't be cultivated or trained. They built a machine to detect it, and the machine waited, is still waiting. I can feel it waiting. Kelly's Varn looked up. Entries like these continue for 14 months, progressively more focused, progressively more certain. The final entry, dated the morning of the breach, reads, "Today, whatever happens after today, the waiting ends." A conquered intelligence analyst was the final prosecution witness. Fen Loris was a quiet human man who had the careful manner of someone accustomed to delivering conclusions that nobody wanted to hear. He testified that Dale had no known connections to any antiquities trafficking network, no prior criminal record, no financial transactions suggesting a commercial motive, and no history of psychiatric instability prior to the events in question. In your assessment, Savuteln asked the analyst, what was the defendant's motive? The analyst, a quiet human man named Fen Loris, looked at his notes, then at Dale, then back at his notes. Personal obsession. Every communication we recovered, messages, journal entries, research notes, points to a single fixation, the Valeth throne and its original function. The defendant believed, genuinely, that the throne was trying to communicate with him, and that reaching it was a matter of, I don't know another word for it, obligation. He treated the expedition as something he was required to do, not something he chose. Required by whom? By the throne itself. Savuteln let that hang, then sat down. The implication was clear. The defendant was delusional. A man driven by a fantasy about an ancient monument speaking to him across light years. The prosecution didn't need to prove madness. They only needed the tribunal to find the testimony unpersuasive, which the words personal obsession and fixation were designed to accomplish. But Fen Loris wasn't finished. He looked at Adhaven. I should note, for completeness, that the defendant's research was accurate. His translations of the architect texts, the fragments he'd acquired, were verified by our linguistic team against the Concord's own databases. Every translation was correct, including passages that have not been published in any accessible academic source. He either had access to classified archives, which our investigation found no evidence of, or he was able to independently reconstruct translations that professional linguists have been working on for decades. The chamber went quiet. Dale saw Dalu Orsh in the gallery lean forward, her expression shifting from judicial composure to something more complicated. The tribunal will now hear from the defendant, Adhaven said. Dale stood. The restraints hummed at his wrists. The throne sat 10 meters away, its tessellated basalt surface catching the light in that shifting way he remembered. The script seemed brighter than it had that morning. He wondered if anyone else had noticed. Judging by the way one of the academic consultants kept glancing at the throne and then looking away, as if checking whether what he was seeing was real, at least one person had. "Tell the tribunal," Adhavin said, "in your own words why you bypassed the seals at Keth Saranu." "Because the throne asked me to." The quiet that followed was not the polite quiet of a court in session. It was the deeper kind, the silence that follows a statement too strange to process immediately. The held breath before a room decides whether it is hearing revelation or madness. "Explain," Adhavin said. "I found a text, an architect text, in a data core I bought for 12 credits on Deepwell Station, a partial translation that described the throne's original function. The architects didn't build it as a monument or a symbol. They built it as a working instrument, a resonance detection mechanism tuned to a specific quality they called the unworn voice. It was designed to find someone, one person, across time and species and distance, whose fundamental resonance matched its calibration. And it was designed to call that person to it." "You believe the throne was calling you?" "I don't believe it. The data supports it. The resonance spike when I entered the antechamber 19%, climbing to 31 in 11 seconds, wasn't random. It was the beginning of a recognition sequence. The throne detected the match it was built to find. 14,000 years of silence, and it began to respond. Not because I intruded, because I arrived." He let that settle. Adhavin was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. The two human arbiters were leaning forward slightly, the body language of people who had stopped evaluating legal arguments and started listening to a story. Scholar Orsh testified about 2,417 claimants in the active era. Every one of them was trying to be worthy. The kings were performing kingship. The monks were performing humility. The philosophers were performing wisdom. Even the children, the ones selected for their innocence, were performing the role of innocence, because the adults who sent them had told them what the throne was looking for, and the children had tried to be that thing. The throne could tell. It could always tell. The difference between trying to be honest and simply being honest is the difference between a recording of a voice and the voice itself. One is a reproduction. The other is a resonance. The throne was built to detect resonance, not reproduction. He paused. The hum was in his chest now, deeper and clearer than it had been all day, a vibration that moved through the floor and into his bones. He could feel the throne paying attention not to his words, which were irrelevant, but to the quality underneath the words. The frequency that he carried the way other people carried heartbeats, involuntarily, constantly, without choice or effort. "I can prove it. I can read every character on that throne's surface. 4,162 characters, arranged in a continuous spiral that begins at the base of the left armrest, winds up and across the backrest, and terminates at the tip of the right armrest's open hand. The final character is a glyph that doesn't appear anywhere else in the known architect corpus. It's not a word. It's a designation." Dalu Orsh gripped the gallery railing. "That is not possible," she said. "The throne's script has never been fully documented. We have partial records of sections, but no complete transcription exists. The barriers prevented close enough access for comprehensive scanning." 4,162 characters, Dale repeated. "I didn't scan them. I read them. From 5 meters away in 11 seconds, because the moment I entered that chamber the throne made itself legible to me in a way I can't explain technically and won't pretend to understand. I saw every character. I can reproduce every one of them." He looked at Adhavin. "Give me a surface. I'll write them, all of them. Your scholars can compare the sections they've already documented. If I'm wrong about even one character in those known sections, convict me on every count." The chamber erupted in low, urgent conversation. Savutelm stood. "Arbiter, this is a stalling tactic. The defendant is attempting to transform a criminal proceeding into an academic exercise. The defendant is offering falsifiable evidence, Sarin Mack cut in. The prosecution's own heritage scholar stated that no complete transcription exists. If my client can produce one from memory, and the known sections match, that directly supports his claim that the throne recognized him, which directly undermines the premise that his presence constituted damage. Adhaven raised a hand. The chamber went quiet. The tribunal will provide a writing surface. The defendant will reproduce the throne's inscription. Heritage scholar Dalu Orsh and one independent academic consultant will verify the output against existing records. This will be entered as evidence. Proceed. They gave him a display tablet with a stylus interface. They unbound his right hand. The restraint on his left wrist stayed active. He stood at the tribunal floor, 10 meters from the throne, and began to write. The characters came without effort, not from memory in the way a student recalls a studied text from somewhere deeper, the way a musician recalls a melody they learned before they had words. His hand moved and the architect's script appeared on the tablet's surface, character after character, the spiral unwinding from left armrest to backrest apex to right armrest in the same continuous flow he'd seen on the stone. He wrote for 47 minutes. The chamber was silent except for the soft scratch of the stylus and the hum of the throne, which had risen not dramatically, not enough to spike the monitoring equipment. They'd brought portable sensors, and a technician watched them with white-knuckled attention, but enough that everyone in the room could feel it. A subsonic vibration in the floor, a pressure in the chest, the sense of something vast and patient paying attention. Dalu Orsh stood at a secondary display, watching the characters appear. She compared them against the partial records. She brought 712 characters from the throne's backrest section, the most thoroughly documented portion. Her face changed as the comparison progressed. At 300 characters matched, she sat down. At 500, she removed her ceremonial headdress and set it on the table beside her, a gesture that Dale understood from his research was a Keith Ronnie sign of profound emotional distress. At 712, a perfect match, no errors, no deviations, she closed the display and pressed both palms flat on the table. The academic consultant, a human xenolinguist named Pavakaran, had been running his own comparison. When Dale completed the 4,162 characters and set down the stylus, Pavakaran spoke. 712 characters from the documented section are a perfect match, 0 discrepancies. The remaining 3,450 characters represent new material that cannot be verified against existing records. He paused. However, the character forms, the grammatical structures, and the contextual patterns are consistent with authenticated architect script. In my professional assessment, this is a genuine, complete transcription of the Valith throne's surface inscription. He looked at the tribunal, then he looked at Dale. His professional composure held, but something in his eyes had shifted the expression of a man who had just witnessed the impossible and was recalibrating everything he knew. I've spent 23 years studying architect script. I can read perhaps 600 characters with confidence. The Concord's entire linguistic team, 12 specialists, decades of combined experience have authenticated roughly 900. This man just reproduced 4,162 in less than an hour from memory, with 0 errors in the verifiable sections. He set down his own stylus. That's not something you learn from a 12-credit data core. That's not something you learn at all. That's something you either are or you aren't. The chamber was still processing his words when a second thing happened that no one had expected. The portable monitoring station, the equipment the prosecution had brought to track the throne's resonance during the trial, emitted a sharp alert tone. The technician, who had been watching the readouts with professional attention throughout the inscription test, went rigid. The resonance is climbing, he said. His voice was tight. 5% above baseline, 6, 7. Adhaven looked at him sharply. Is it a threat? It's not spiking the way it did during the breach. It's building, slowly, like something is warming up. The hum changed. Everyone felt it, not heard felt. A low, tectonic shift in the chamber's atmosphere, as though the air pressure had dropped and then recalibrated around a new center of gravity. The composite panels on the walls vibrated. Observers in the gallery gripped their seats. Adhaven's stylus rolled off the dais and clattered to the floor. In the silence that followed, the Valeth throne began to glow. It started at the base of the left armrest exactly where the spiral inscription began. A pale light, the color of clean quartz in morning sun, tracing the first characters. Not flickering, not pulsing, steady and precise. Each character illuminating in sequence, one after another at the pace of a calm heartbeat. The light moved up the armrest, across the seat's broad front panel and began to climb the backrest. The younger Keithrani delegate made a sound not quite a word, more like the beginning of a prayer her voice couldn't complete. She stood, both hands covering her mouth. Beside her, an older delegate gripped his neighbor's arm, his wrapped vestments trembling. Dalu Orsh stood slowly. The heritage scholar's eyes were fixed on the throne with an expression that had passed through alarm and landed on something Dale recognized, because he'd felt it himself, months ago, reading the phrase "the unworn voice" for the first time. The look of someone who has believed in something their entire life and has just, in a single moment, been given proof. The light reached the backrest's apex, characters blazing white and clear, each one a word in a language Dale could read as easily as his own name. The room had gone so quiet that he could hear individual heartbeats, his own, the nearest observers, the soft mechanical pulse of the portable monitoring equipment, whose technician had stopped watching the readouts and was staring at the throne with his mouth slightly open. The light descended the right side. Dale followed the spiral with his eyes and translated without effort. The seat awaits the voice that does not perform. The seat awaits the voice that carries no mask. The seat awaits the one who speaks and does not hear their own echo, because the voice and the self are the same. We sealed this seat because we could not find that voice among our own. We sealed it in faith that the voice exists somewhere, in some species, in some age. The seal is not a prohibition. It is a patience. When the seat speaks, the seal is answered. The light was 3/4 through the spiral now, each character a small sun blazing in the tesserated stone. The two human arbiters on the dais were staring at the throne with expressions that had passed through shock and arrived somewhere near awe. Adhaven's face was unreadable, but her hands were flat on the desk, pressing down, as though she needed to anchor herself. Savuteln had stopped mid-objection. She stood at the prosecution's table with one hand raised, frozen in the gesture of a legal argument that had just been rendered irrelevant by something older than law. The heritage statutes she'd been citing, the precedents about unauthorized access and cultural desecration, all of it assumed that the sealed monument was inert, a protected object, something to be preserved in its original state. The throne was not inert. It was completing a function it had waited 14,000 years to execute, and it was doing so in the middle of a tribunal convened to punish the man who triggered it. The light reached the right armrest. Characters blazed from stone, and the entire spiral was illuminated end to end. The throne sat on its platform, transformed, no longer a relic, no longer exhibit evidence, but a living instrument fulfilling the purpose for which it had been made. Then the final character, the one at the tip of the right armrest's open hand, the glyph that existed nowhere else in the architect corpus, flared brighter than the rest. A single, clean pulse of light that cast long shadows across the chamber, painting the faces of 60 observers in white and pale gold. The throne spoke. Not through speakers, not through vibration alone. The voice emerged from the stone itself, from the crystalline structure of the tesserated basalt, resonating through the mineral lattice the way a tuning fork resonates through metal, deep and unhurried, not loud, the opposite of loud. The voice had the quality of something that had always been speaking, at a frequency too low for ears, and had now, for the first time, shifted into the range where beings could hear it. As though it had been whispering for 14,000 years and had finally found someone close enough to listen. It carried the weight of a mechanism that had held its silence for longer than most civilizations had existed, longer than the Keithrani had been a spacefaring people, longer than the conquered had existed, longer than any institution in the chamber, legal, religious, academic, had been alive. It said 3 words. 3 words in architect script that every person in the chamber understood without translation, because the throne's resonance carried meaning directly, not through language, but through the same bone-deep channel that Dale had felt from 30 meters away 4 months ago, from 90 meters before that, from halfway across the spiral arm before that. The words arrived not in the ears but in the chest, the way a parent's voice arrives in a child who has been lost and hears their name called from across a crowded space. Last honest voice. The words filled the chamber. They hung in the air for a long moment, 3, 4, 5 seconds of absolute silence in which nobody breathed and nobody moved, and the monitoring technician's equipment registered a resonance peak that would later be described in academic papers as a harmonic convergence event without precedent in the recorded history of prestellar artifacts. Then the words settled, the way a struck bell settles, not fading, integrating, becoming part of the room's acoustic memory, becoming part of every person who had heard them. The glow on the throne's surface dimmed to a steady, ambient luminescence. The hum dropped to a low, continuous tone that felt like the room itself was breathing. The carved hands at the ends of the armrests seemed fractionally more open than they had been before, or perhaps that was a trick of the new light, the throne's steady glow changing the shadows on its surface. Dale exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. The restraint on his left wrist felt loose, not malfunctioning, but irrelevant, the way a lock feels irrelevant when the door it's guarding has been opened from the other side. He stood naturally, without effort, without posture, the same way he'd always stood, the same way he stood on Deepwell Station, elbow-deep in fluid couplings, the same way he stood in junk lots, turning over data cores, the same way he stood in the antechamber of Keth Saranu, 5 meters from a mechanism that had been sleeping for 14 millennia and had woken because it heard something in him that it recognized. Not greatness, not heroism, not a chosen destiny or a hidden bloodline or a secret inheritance. The throne recognized the absence of performance, the man who was exactly what he appeared to be, all the way down, with nothing between his surface and his center. The maintenance technician who fixed things because they were broken and read old languages because they interested him and walked into sealed chambers because the call was real and he was constitutionally incapable of pretending it wasn't. The last honest voice. The voice that did not echo because the voice and the self were the same. The silence lasted perhaps 20 seconds. Then Adhavin spoke. The tribunal will recess too. Arbiter. Dalu Orsh's voice cut across the chamber. The heritage scholar was standing. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were bright with tears she did not try to hide. The custodial body of Keth Saranu withdraws its charges. Savuteln turned sharply. Scholar Orsh, you cannot unilaterally. The throne has spoken. Dalu Orsh's voice carried the weight of a woman whose entire faith had just been validated in front of 60 witnesses. In 14,000 years it has never spoken, not once. Our entire covenant, our entire reason for preserving it, generation after generation, for 11,000 years, was built on the belief that it would speak when the right person arrived. She looked at Dale, tears running freely now, voice steady. That person has arrived. He is standing in our tribunal in restraints, being prosecuted for answering the call we have been waiting 14,000 years to hear. We withdraw all charges. The seals were not violated, they were answered. The younger Keithrani delegate stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying in the absolute stillness. Let the record show that the custodial body of Keth Saranu recognizes the activation of the Valith throne as a legitimate recognition event, consistent with the foundational texts of our covenant. A third delegate rose, then a fourth. One by one, every Keithrani representative in the gallery stood, and the chamber filled with the soft rustle of white vestments as an entire cultural body aligned behind what its sacred monument had just declared. Savuteln looked at Adhaven. The lead arbiter's expression had changed, not softened exactly, but recalibrated, the way a precision instrument recalibrates when the input exceeds its expected range. Without the complainant's participation, the heritage charges are without standing, Adhaven said. The jurisdictional violations remain as matters of conquered law. She paused. She looked at the throne, still glowing, still humming, still radiating its low, settled tone. Then she looked at the monitoring technician. What is the current resonance reading? The technician blinked, looked at his equipment and swallowed. 2% above baseline, stable, but the waveform profile has changed. It's not the same pattern we've been monitoring for 3 centuries. He trailed off. It's more complex, richer, like the difference between a single instrument playing one note and an orchestra warming up. Adhaven nodded. The tribunal notes that the circumstances are without precedent, and that imposing punitive sanctions on an individual who has been publicly identified by a Class 7 heritage monument as its legitimate activator would raise substantial questions of legal coherence. She folded her hands. All charges are dismissed. The defendant is released. The Valith throne will be returned to Keth Saranu under enhanced custodial protocols, and the defendant will be granted supervised access to the site, pending a formal recognition agreement between the conquered and the custodial body of Keth Saranu. She paused. This tribunal is adjourned. The restraint on Dale's left wrist released with a small click. He rubbed the skin where it had pressed and looked at the throne. The glow was steady, warm, patient. The script on its surface pulsed with a slow, ambient rhythm that matched his heartbeat, not because the throne was imitating him, but because both rhythms had always been the same. 2 instruments tuned to the same frequency, separated by 14,000 years and half a spiral arm, finally in the same room. The chamber began to empty slowly, not the brisk, efficient clearing of a routine adjournment, but the careful, stunned withdrawal of people who had witnessed something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to articulate. The conquered officials moved in tight clusters, speaking in low voices, glancing back at the throne as they filed through the main arch. The academic consultants lingered, several of them making notes on their tablets with hands that weren't entirely steady. Ilatorek, the resonance engineer, stood at her monitoring station and stared at the waveform display as though it contained a message written specifically for her. Pavakaran, the xenolinguist who had authenticated the inscription, approached the prosecution's table, where Savuteln was gathering her materials with the rigid composure of someone whose entire case had just been dismantled by a mechanism she was theologically obligated to revere. He spoke to her quietly. Dale couldn't hear the words, but he saw Savuteln's hand stop moving, saw her look at the throne, saw something in her expression shift from professional humiliation to something rawer and more honest. She nodded once, set her materials down, and left the chamber without looking back. Saren Mack, his defense advocate, the tired woman who'd drawn his case from the public pool, walked past him on her way out. She stopped. "For what it's worth," she said, "that's the strangest case I've ever worked, and the only one where I didn't have to do anything. The throne did all the closing arguments." She paused. "Good luck, Corin, whatever happens next." She left. The gallery was nearly empty now. Reth Davari, the lead warden who had arrested him on Keth Serrano, stood near the main arch. He hadn't left. He was watching Dale with an expression that was no longer angry. It was something closer to the look the young warden had worn when the Hum had followed Dale out of the antechamber 4 months ago. Not fear, reassessment. The slow, uncomfortable process of a competent professional realizing that the person he'd arrested might have been telling the truth all along. Reth Davari nodded once, not a greeting, not an apology, just an acknowledgement, and walked out. Dalu Orsh approached. She moved with the deliberate dignity of the Keithrani, but her eyes were bright and her voice, when she spoke, carried a tremor she did not try to control. "Do you understand what you are?" Dale considered the question. He thought about Deepwell Station, about the fluid couplings and the atmospheric recyclers, and the quiet evenings spent reading languages no one else cared about. He thought about the 12-credit data core, and the phrase "the unworn voice," and the 14 months of obsession that had cost him everything he'd had and given him back the one thing he'd never known he was missing. He thought about the fact that the throne had not chosen him for anything he'd done, any skill he'd mastered, any trial he'd passed. It had chosen him for what he was, for the one quality that couldn't be earned or learned or performed, the simple, undecorated fact of being exactly himself, all the way through, without apology or disguise. "I'm a maintenance technician," he said, "who apparently needed to come home." He looked past her at the throne. The glow on its surface was steady and warm, the script pulsing with that slow heartbeat rhythm. The carved hands at the ends of the armrests were open, palms up, waiting. They had been waiting for 14,000 years. They would wait as long as they needed to. That was what patience looked like when it was built into stone. "What happens now?" he asked. Not to Dalu Orsh specifically, to the room, to the situation, to the fact that a maintenance technician from an industrial station had just been identified by an ancient alien mechanism as the thing it had been built to find, and there was no precedent for what came next. Dalu Orsh smiled. It was a complicated smile, grief and relief and reverence, and something that might have been joy, compressed into the small movement of an old scholar's mouth. She looked at the throne, then back at Dale, and the answer she gave was the simplest and most profound thing anyone had said in that chamber all day. "Now we learn what the throne was built to do, with you sitting in it." The words landed quietly. Dale thought about the open stone hands, about the seat built for a body shape that matched no known species, about the possibility, the staggering, humbling, terrifying possibility that the body shape it had been built for was his, not because he was special, because he was the one thing the architects had never been able to produce among themselves, a person who didn't perform. "Welcome," Dalu Orsh said. "We have waited a very long time." Behind them, the Valeth throne hummed its low, steady tone, the sound of a mechanism that had completed its purpose, the sound of a patience that had finally been rewarded, the sound of an ancient question that had found, after 14,000 years of silence, the only answer it had ever been built to accept. Dale Corin stood in the sterile tribunal chamber on Verath Null, a maintenance technician from an industrial station, unrestrained, unhurried, and listened to the throne breathe. He did not feel chosen. He did not feel powerful. He did not feel transformed. He felt, for the first time in his life, like the hum inside him and the hum outside him were the same sound. That was enough. That had always been enough. The architects had known it 14,000 years ago. The throne had known it from the moment the stone had formed around the language. And now, with 60 witnesses and 3 arbiters, and a chamber full of white-vested Keithrani who had preserved a faith longer than most species had existed, the rest of the galaxy would learn what an honest voice sounded like, not through conquest or revelation or spectacle, but through the quiet, unperformed truth of a man who had simply been what he was. The light on the throne's surface settled into its permanent glow. The chamber began to empty. And Dale Corin, maintenance technician, Third class. The last honest voice stood where he was and breathed, and let the hum carry him home.